On a morning in mid-September of 1943, over the Solomon Islands, a young Marine pilot from Ohio stared at the Japanese Zero, climbing upward in a perfect vertical pull, and he knew with absolute certainty that the move was meant to end him because his F4U Corsair, the heavy bent wing machine many old hands mockingly called the Ensign Eliminator, could not climb with a Zero at any altitude, and the Japanese pilot was almost certainly smiling as he set up his trusted trick of climbing stalling, flipping downward and dropping directly onto the tail of anyone foolish enough to follow. Yet the boy from Ohio had learned something new about his Corsair that the Japanese had not discovered, because hidden inside its wings were 650 caliber machine guns set by dedicated mechanics to converge their fire at exactly 1,000 feet. And when all 6 streams met inside that narrow range, the result became a single crushing blow that could tear any plane apart in less than a heartbeat, so all he needed was 1 clean second at the right distance to turn the tables on the enemy swooping above him. And as the Zero reached the top of its climb, confident and almost lazy in its execution, the Marine shoved his stick forward, letting the Corsair drop in a steep dive to make it look as if he were fleeing. And he knew the Zero would follow, because Japanese pilots held 2 years of victories over American fighters, and they had grown used to out-turning and out-climbing them. Opponents, but physics shifted when the Corsair fell through the air with the weight of a 2,000-pound advantage, and that great weight allowed the bent wing fighter to convert altitude into speed faster than anything else in the Pacific. So the airspeed needle crept past 300, then 350, then over 400 miles per hour, while the Zero followed as best it could, but could not match that terrifying plunge. And then at 3,000 feet, the Marine hauled back on the stick, and the Corsair groaned as 6-7. Then 8GS pressed him into his seat so hard that his vision tunneled into grey shadows, but the wings held firm, because the Corsair was built for punishment, and built to survive what lighter fighters could not. And as expected, the Zero could not follow the same pull-out at that speed, and its pilot was forced to ease his turn, which gave the American just enough room to swing around in a high-speed barrel roll, trading all that dive energy for the perfect angle. And when the roll completed, he found himself 1,000 feet behind the Zero, with the Japanese plane filling his gun sight. And for a second and a half, he held the trigger steady, and 6 ropes of lead gathered into one tight storm no wider than a dining table, and the Zero simply ceased to exist, shredded into drifting pieces, before the pilot ever knew he was in danger, for he had been preparing for an easy kill, and never saw the Corsair sweep behind him. And Lieutenant James Hanson, the Ohio farm boy, felt his hands shake as he steadied the stick, because though this was his 3rd victory in his new Corsair, it was the first time he truly felt what his mechanics had tried to explain, that once the convergence was correct, nothing could survive that precise fury, and the Japanese still fought these new Marines as if they were flying wild cats or P-40 fighters, spraying loose patterns of bullets that scattered wide. But the Corsair was different, because 6 guns channeled together at one fixed distance changed the simple math of survival. And though the Corsair was feared for killing its own pilots in training, thanks to its long nose that hid the runway and its stiff landing gear that bounced brutally on carrier decks and its sudden stall that snapped without warning, the Marines of Squadron VMF-124 had no choice when they received the aircraft, because they needed something that could challenge the Zeros dominating the Solomons. And they had only 2 short weeks in early September to learn how to fly a machine that had caused more deaths in training than in real combat. And their commander, Major William Gissy, told them plainly that they would either master the bird or the bird would kill them. And their first test came on September 14th, when 8 Corsairs escorted bombers toward Kahili Airfield, and were met by 30 Zeros that should have overwhelmed them 4-1. Yet the battle did not go as expected, because the mechanic from Detroit, Sergeant Paul Noak, had spent 3 straight nights adjusting the guns by hand bore, sighting them again and again, so that at 1,000 feet the concentration of fire became so dense that any enemy caught inside it would not survive, and that decision altered the entire fight. And in 12 minutes the Corsairs shot down 6 Zeros and damaged 4 others without losing a single Marine, and the Japanese, who attacked with their usual high side passes, expecting the Americans to try to dogfight, were stunned when the Corsairs refused to turn tightly, and instead used dive speed and superior energy to shape the range until they struck only inside the perfect distance. And one pilot, Lieutenant Ray Walsh from Boston, watched a Zero drift across his nose at 800 feet. and when he fired for barely 2 seconds, he sliced the wing from the Zero cleanly and saw the pilot bail out wearing an expression not of terror but of confusion, because he had no idea how the bent wing fighters had achieved such sudden destructive power, and within days rumors spread among Japanese squadrons about a new American aircraft, but they did not yet understand that it was not the guns but the mathematics behind their alignment that made the difference. And across the Solomons, the Marines kept flying through storms and heat and exhaustion and loss, while learning to trust a machine that was as deadly to careless pilots as it was to the enemy, yet for all its flaws in landing and stalling, the Corsair soared in battle, because when it reached 1,000 feet behind a target, it became the most lethal fighter in the Pacific. And Lieutenant Hanson, the young man from Ohio, knew that the war had changed the moment he saw a Zero dissolve under a single burst from 6 perfectly aligned guns, and he also knew that the Japanese airmen had not yet learned to fear that distance, but they would soon enough. Sergeant Paul Noak, the stubborn mechanic from Detroit, had been the first to understand what the Corsair truly needed, and he spent night after night crouched beneath the bent wings, adjusting each 50 caliber barrel until all 6 would deliver their fire into one single point at exactly 1,000 feet. And when he explained to the pilots that outside that distance their guns were no better than rocks thrown from a speeding truck, but inside it they became a storm dense enough to tear steel apart, the men listened because they trusted the quiet man who handled their machines with the care of a surgeon. And the truth of his work became clear during those first sharp 12 minutes of combat, when the Corsairs tore through 6 Japanese fighters, damaged 4 more, and did not lose a single aircraft. And the Japanese had entered the fight using all their usual maneuvers, sweeping from above in high-side passes, expecting the new American planes to try to turn with them. But the Marines no longer played by those rules, and instead used their speed to control the range, diving away whenever a Zero crept behind, then climbing or looping back only when they could close to that exact measured distance where the converging guns were unstoppable. And Lieutenant Ray Walsh learned this lesson in the most direct way possible when a Zero flashed across his nose at barely 800 feet, and he pressed the trigger for less than 2 seconds and watched the focused fire slice enemy aircraft apart. And as the Japanese pilot bailed out, the stunned look on his face said everything, because he could not understand how a single burst had removed his wing at the root. And soon the Japanese began whispering among themselves about the new American fighter that seemed to kill with impossible speed, though none yet understood that the secret was not power but precision. And while they tried to adapt by increasing their attack distance, hoping to stay beyond the reach of this strange killing zone, they only made things easier for the Marines, because at 2,000 feet, dispersed fire from the Zeros could hardly scratch the armor wrapped around the Corsair, while even a single glancing hit from an aligned burst of 50 calibers could cripple the lightly built Japanese planes. And so Noak became the most valued man in the squadron, for every evening he would crawl under each Corsair and measure the alignment again, insisting on perfection, and telling the pilots that a mistake of even 100 feet could turn a certain kill into a wasted burst that might get them killed in turn. And while Noak worked, the skies over the Solomons changed as October arrived, with storms that came at the Marines sideways, winds at 50 miles per hour, and rain that washed through the strip at Munda until the runway felt more like a swamp. Yet nothing halted the missions, because the Japanese were still reinforcing Bougainville, running supply ships down the dark channel known as the Slot, and so the Corsairs flew in conditions no sane pilot would accept in peacetime, climbing through clouds, rising to 30,000 feet, flying by instinct and luck. And Lieutenant Bob Harper from Tennessee learned just how brutal these storms could be when he was caught in a thunderhead at 20,000 feet, and the Corsair flipped inverted, then spun, then flipped again, while his horizon tumbled uselessly, ice building on the wings, and the engine choking and catching in sputtering bursts. And for 20 minutes he fought the controls, unsure half the time whether he was upright or upside down, until he finally burst from the clouds, only 2,000 feet above the ocean, and more than 40 miles from where he thought he was. And yet the Corsair held together and brought him home. And as the storms raged, the quiet teacher from Kansas, Lieutenant David Moore, became squadron thinker, analyzing how the Corsair behaved in different air densities, and discovering that at sea level its heavy torque made it sluggish, but at 15,000 feet the thinner air transformed it into a completely different animal, suddenly sharper and surprisingly nimble, not as agile as Zero, but nimble enough to catch a Japanese pilot off guard, and Moore began designing new maneuvers, including his favorite, the vertical scissors, where instead of simply diving away from a pursuing Zero, he would pull up sharply into a zoom climb, drawing the Zero after him until the Japanese fighter closed distance, and then he would suddenly throttle back and drop flaps, stalling in midair and forcing the Zero to overshoot. And in that moment, he would drop the nose, retract the flaps, and chase downward with 3 perfect seconds to fire inside the convergence zone. And within 1 week, his maneuver claimed 4 zeros. And once the Japanese realized they were losing fighters to these sudden reversals, they changed their plan and began attacking in larger groups, focusing on coordination and using numbers to overwhelm a single American fighter by pressing attacks from several angles at once. But the Marines refused to fight alone and instead modified the thatch weave into a far more aggressive tactic, using paired fighters to pull Zeros into predictable paths where another Corsair could sweep behind and fire through the point of convergence. And soon even brief snapshots became lethal as 1 second of fire destroyed entire aircraft. And then November 1st of 1943 arrived, and with it the full fury of the Solomons. The invasion of Bougainville sent every Japanese fighter aloft, and VMF-124 launched everything that could fly 18 Corsairs racing to meet more than 70 enemy planes, and the odds were so hopeless that Major Geisy spoke more like a man preparing for a funeral than a battle, telling his pilots that the enemy had numbers, but the Americans had precision, and if they were going to die, they should at least make the cost unbearable. And so, battle began at 23,000 feet with the sun behind the Japanese and the sky filled with descending Zero formations, and the Marines split into pairs, weaving and diving and climbing with perfect discipline. And again, the Zeros threw themselves into attacks only for another Corsair to slip behind them at exactly 1,000 feet and fire. And each time the converging guns ended the encounter before the Japanese pilot even realized death was approaching. And the day became a turning point, proving beyond any doubt that the convergence zone was not theory but a weapon, sharper than any sword ever carried by the Empire of Japan. The invasion of Bougainville on the first day of November in 1943 forced every Japanese fighter squadron in the Solomons into the sky, while VMF-124 launched every Corsair that could still climb, and the Marines knew they were outnumbered before they even reached altitude, because 18 bent-wing fighters were flying toward more than 70 enemy aircraft. And yet Major Geisy gathered them before takeoff and reminded them that numbers meant nothing if the Japanese could not keep out of the convergence zone, and he told them to stay in pairs, to trust their guns, and to make the enemy pay dearly for every inch of sky. And when the battle began at 23,000 feet, the Japanese had arranged themselves perfectly with the sun at their backs and a massive height advantage, and their sweeping attack should have shattered the American formation. But the Corsairs split into paired elements, each pilot guarding his partner, and every time a Zero committed to attacking one Corsair, another would curl behind it, closing to that precise 1,000-foot distance that turned 6 guns into a wall of destruction. And Lieutenant Hansen from Ohio found himself separated from his wingman with 3 Zeros boxing him in. And there was only one move left, and he pointed the nose straight down and let gravity drag the Corsair faster than any Zero could comfortably follow, and the airspeed rushed toward 450, then 470, then 490, and the indicator pegged out at 500, while the fuselage shook and the controls grew heavy, and the Zeros struggled to maintain their dive and began to break formation, and Hansen pulled out at 8 GS with his vision fading to black, and when he recovered he was alive 2 miles away from the battle, the engine running hot and the oil pressure trembling, but he pulled back into the fight because he refused to leave his squadron, while a lone Zero below him focused on strafing a transport ship, and the Japanese pilot never looked up, and Hansen rolled his Corsair inverted, dove into a clean split S, and held fire as the distance shrank from 1,200 feet to 1,100 to 1,050, and then to exactly 1,000, and when he squeezed the trigger the burst tore the Zero apart so violently it looked as though the plane had been stuffed with explosives. Near, by another pilot, the farmer from Iowa, Lieutenant Carl Peterson, applied his own method of fighting because he had grown up hunting ducks, and knew how to lead a moving target. And while most gunners aimed directly at what they saw, he calculated where the Zero would be the moment it entered the convergence zone, and he fired into empty air, trusting the Japanese plane to fly into the storm waiting ahead. And this unusual technique earned him 3 kills that day, including one that seemed almost like art when he shot into an empty patch of sky, and the Zero, diving on a wounded Corsair, flew directly into that invisible point and disintegrated before the Japanese pilot realized the hunter was behind him. And as the battle raged, the sky filled with twisting trails of smoke and flashes of fire. And for 43 minutes the Marines fought until VMF 124 claimed 17 confirmed victories, losing 2 Corsairs, 1 pilot killed and another rescued from the water. And the Japanese survivors later reported that the American fighters seemed to use some new terrifying weapon that caused planes to vanish in a single heartbeat. And they were not wrong, because the weapon was the mathematics behind 6 perfectly aligned guns converging on a fixed distance. And the price for that precision fell heavily on the pilots, because the constant G-forces and the brutal strain were slowly breaking their bodies, and Lieutenant Commander Stephen Banks, the doctor from Maryland, began seeing compression fractures in spines, burst blood vessels in eyes, and hernias forming from the violent strain of breathing under 8 GS. And he told the squadron that human bodies were never designed to endure such forces again and again. And the mechanic from Detroit was the first to notice how the men walked stiff and slow like elderly men, though they were barely 25, and yet none of them complained, because resting meant leaving your partner to fight alone. And so they kept flying with makeshift back braces made from scraps of aluminum, and kept squeezing into cockpits, though their vision blurred and their joints ached. And December arrived, bringing a new kind of danger, because the Japanese at last understood that the Americans were killing them at 1,000 feet. And they adjusted by making slashing attacks, refusing to stay in the convergence zone for more than a blink. And the fights became high-speed glimpses where each side fired only a few rounds before breaking away. And though the kill rate dropped, the losses also decreased, and air combat turned into a violent chess match played at 400 miles per hour. And the teacher from Kansas adapted again, using the sun, the clouds, and even the islands as tools shaping enemy movements, so that Zeros would be forced into predictable paths. And on December 15th, he demonstrated his idea perfectly with 4 Corsairs against 12 Zeros near New Georgia. And instead of turning into a chaotic dogfight, he led his flight in what looked like a retreat toward a towering cloud, while another Corsair element waited unseen behind it. And when the Zeros shot through the cloud in pursuit, they flew directly into 3 perfectly aligned convergence zones, and 3 Japanese planes vanished in 4 seconds, and the rest scattered in panic, fearing another unseen ambush. And once again the Japanese shifted tactics, using single-plane decoys to draw out the Americans while hiding their real attack behind them. But Major Geisy had insisted on strict fire discipline, and no pilot fired unless the shot was certain, because revealing their position for a maybe could get them killed. And by January of 1944, new replacements arrived, and though they had trained safely in the States, they had no idea how violent real combat in the Solomons would be. And the first one to face it, Tom Willis from Nebraska, threw up in his oxygen mask during his first high-G maneuver and nearly drowned at 18,000 feet. And though no one laughed, they all understood, because they had once been the same. And on his 3rd mission, Willis found himself alone with 2 Zeros setting up a coordinated attack, while every lesson he knew told him to dive away. But he remembered the mechanic telling him that the convergence zone was about time as much as distance, and that a Zero traveling 300 miles per hour covered 150 feet in the third of a second. It took 50 caliber bullets to arrive, and so Willis aimed not where the plane was but where it would be, and fired into empty air, and watched as the first Zero flew directly into the storm and was cut in half, and the second panicked and made the fatal mistake of giving Willis its tail at exactly the wrong distance, and in one brief second the Corsair took it apart. And high above the Pacific, Lieutenant Hansen, the ghost who flew low above the waves, used the dark blue paint of his Corsair as camouflage, so he could rise from the sea like a phantom and strike before anyone noticed. And the Japanese whispered about the unseen hunter who appeared only long enough to send another Zero into the ocean. and vanish again, leaving only drifting debris as proof he had ever been there at all. By early December, the Japanese fighter leaders realized the Americans were not winning because of a faster aircraft, but because they had mastered a precise killing distance, and once that truth reached their command tents, they began ordering their pilots to never linger inside that 1,000-foot danger zone and instead to dive in with sharp slashing attacks, then break away before the Marines could tighten the angle and fire. And this shift created a strange new rhythm in the sky above the Solomons, where engagements lasted only seconds with 2 or 3 rounds fired before both sides vanished into opposite directions only to merge again like striking blades. And though this reduced the number of kills, it also lowered losses, and air combat slowly changed into a high-speed chess match fought at 400 miles per hour, where instinct calculation and prediction mattered more than raw aggression. And the quiet teacher from Kansas, Lieutenant David Moore, adapted first because he saw patterns where others saw only chaos, and he realized the Japanese could not help but follow certain predictable lines when sunlight, clouds, or terrain forced their hands, and he began using sun as a blinding shield, the clouds as ambush curtains, and even island silhouettes as funnels that shaped enemy attacks. And on December 15th, he proved his theory in what would later be called the Cloud Trap, with 4 Corsairs facing 12 Zeros over New Georgia. And instead of turning into a furious dogfight, he led his flight toward a towering cloud bank, making it seem as if they were retreating, but on the far side, hidden from view, he had positioned another Corsair element waiting silently, and when the Zeros burst through the cloud in tight pursuit, they flew directly into convergence zones of the waiting fighters, and 3 Japanese aircraft were destroyed in 4 seconds before the others scattered in terrified confusion. And for the first time, the enemy realized the Marines were not only fighting harder, but thinking harder, and once again the Japanese changed their tactics, sending lone decoy planes to provoke the Corsairs into firing and revealing their position, while the real attack force crept silently from another angle. But Major Geisy had drilled into every pilot that fire discipline was sacred, and that they must never squeeze the trigger unless the kill was certain, and so the decoys failed, and the squadron kept its advantage through patience and cold precision. And then January of 1944 arrived with replacement pilots fresh from wide-open training fields in the States, and they believed they understood the Corsair, but none of the instructors had shown them the terrifying reality of combat, where violent G-forces crushed lungs, blurred vision, and left the cockpit spinning. And the first replacement to face it, a kid from Nebraska named Tom Willis, almost died on his first engagement after vomiting in his oxygen mask during a high G reversal and nearly suffocating at 18,000 feet. But the veterans did not mock him, because they had all been shaken once, and when he returned to the air on his 3rd mission, he found himself alone, separated from his flight, with 2 Zeros preparing a coordinated attack, and every rule from training told him to dive away and escape using the Corsair speed. But he remembered an offhand lesson from Sergeant Noak, who once told him that convergence was not only about distance, but about time, because at 1,000 feet, 50 caliber rounds needed 1/3 of a second to reach their target. And in that same 1/3 of a second, a Zero flying at 300 miles per hour traveled roughly 150 feet. And Willis realized that if he fired at where the enemy was, he would miss. But if he fired at where the Zero would be the moment the bullets arrived, then the plane would fly directly into the kill zone. And so he aimed ahead, fired into empty air, and watched in shock as the first Zero flew straight into the storm and was sliced in half just behind the cockpit. And the second Japanese pilot panicked and turned away, giving Willis his tail at exactly the wrong range. And the young Nebraskan fired a single clean burst, and the Zero came apart like it had been made of dry leaves, and news of his success spread through the squadron, proving that even the newest pilot could master the deadly mathematics of the convergence zone. And far below the cloud line, Lieutenant Hansen, the farm boy from Ohio, who the Japanese now called the Ghost because he seemed to appear out of the sea itself, refined his own terrifying technique. He flew barely 50 feet above the waves, so low that his prop wash kicked up spray, leaving the deep blue Corsair nearly invisible against the shimmering water, and he used islands and ridges as cover, waiting until distracted Japanese fighters climbed or banked, then rising behind them like a shadow, and closing fast into the 1,000-foot range, before firing a single burst and dropping back to the sea before anyone noticed. And on January 20th, he struck a formation of 8 Zeros attacking a convoy, and the first trailing Zero exploded before the others realized anything was wrong. And Hansen repeated the attack twice more, each time rising, firing, and vanishing, until he had destroyed 3 planes without a single Japanese pilot catching a glimpse of him. And once they finally understood a phantom was stalking them from below, they climbed hard, searching the empty sky. But he was already 5 miles away, skimming the waves, heading home unseen. And February brought the brutal raids on Rabaul, where the Corsairs had only a sliver of fuel margin and could afford no drawn-out engagements because 10 minutes of turning or climbing meant not enough fuel to return. And so they fought with clinical efficiency, diving, once closing to 1,000 feet, firing and breaking away. And on the first sweep, they shot down 14 Japanese aircraft in 12 minutes, losing only 1 Corsair to anti-aircraft fire, and that pilot, the same young Nebraskan who had survived his near drowning, steered his burning plane into the sea to keep it from crashing into the Rabaul seaplane base, and his last radio words were a soft apology to his mother for not writing more often, and the teacher from Kansas grew thoughtful, writing home that the convergence zone had turned air combat into something almost mathematical, because survival no longer depended solely on reflex or courage, but on understanding a perfect intersection of angles, speeds, and distances, and that the pilot who mastered that geometry lived, and the one who failed to see it died. And as the months passed, the pilots grew quiet and hollow-eyed, carrying the burden of precision that saved them, and the weight of knowing that every time they fired at 1,000 feet, another man ceased to exist in a fraction of a second. Lieutenant Hansen, the Ohio farm boy now known across Japanese fighter units as the Ghost, continued refining his low-level attack method until it became something terrifyingly precise. And on that January morning, when a group of 8 Zeros dove against an American convoy, he rose from the waves like a spectre, his dark blue Corsair barely visible above the water, and his convergence adjusted slightly closer to 900 feet by Sergeant Noak to tighten the impact pattern. And Hansen popped upward behind the trailing Japanese fighter, fired a single 1-second burst, then dropped back toward the sea before the others sensed anything, and the Zero exploded so suddenly that the pilots ahead believed for a moment that ship anti-aircraft had hit him. And when Hansen repeated the attack twice more, each time rising, firing, and vanishing, the formation finally scattered, climbing wildly in search of an attacker they could not see, but he was already 5 miles away, skimming the waves on his return path. And February arrived with the long-feared raids on Rabaul, a fortress crowded with fighters, heavy guns, and experienced Japanese squadrons, and the Corsairs had to fly at extreme range with barely 10 minutes of fuel available for fighting, which meant that if any pilot allowed himself to get trapped in a circling dogfight, he would not have the fuel to return home. And yet the convergence zone required only a brief moment, a single pass, a tight swing into 1,000 feet, a sharp controlled burst, and then withdrawal. And so the first sweep over Rabaul felt almost unreal because the Japanese climbed confidently, expecting a swirling battle. But the Marines did not give them one, and instead each Corsair made a single attack, selecting one target, closing, firing, and moving on. And in 12 minutes, VMF 124 shot down 14 Japanese aircraft, losing only 1 Corsair to ground fire, and that pilot was the young Nebraskan who had once vomited into his mask and nearly died, and he aimed his burning plane toward open water so it would not hit the seaplane base, and his last radio words were a soft regret that he had not written home more often, and his sacrifice settled over the squadron like a heavy stone. And the teacher from Kansas grew reflective, writing to his wife that the convergence zone had begun to make combat feel less like warfare and more like geometry, a cold, mathematical intersection where if one pilot understood the lines and the timing, he survived, and if he miscalculated, he vanished, and March brought the exhausted squadron back to Espiritu Santo for rest, though rest meant little more than sleeping 12 hours straight and trying to stop their hands from trembling. And Lieutenant Commander Stephen Banks, the doctor from Maryland, examined each man with growing concern, documenting vertebrae that had cracked from repeated G-forces, retinas shaken by the violent turns, kidneys bruised by relentless vibration. And he concluded that the Corsair airmen were 25-year-olds living inside 70-year-old bodies. And even so, the pilots felt guilt for being grounded because resting meant not fighting beside their friends. And while they recovered, the numbers were recorded, and VMF-124 had achieved 93 confirmed kills in 6 months with 12 Corsairs lost, and the ratio was astonishing because when the convergence zone was used properly, the squadron achieved an 8-to-1 kill ratio, far surpassing anything previously recorded by American fighters, which usually managed 2-to-1 on their best days. And this was not luck or superior flying, it was the simple truth that 6 guns meeting in one point created too much concentrated force for any fighter to survive. And Sergeant Noak received orders to return home in April. And he had endured 18 months in the Pacific battling dysentery and malaria until he weighed barely 130 pounds, yet before leaving he trained 3 new mechanics in the difficult art of bore sighting and drilled into them that 1,000 feet meant exactly 1,000, not 990, not 1,010, and he made them practice in the dark because Japanese night raids never offered perfect lighting, and the Ohio farm boy Hansen rose as the squadron highest scoring pilot, reaching 24 confirmed kills, all but 2 obtained inside the convergence zone. And the 2 exceptions came from desperate enemy pilots who attempted ramming attacks, were torn apart at point-blank range, though Hansen never counted those as true victories because they required no skill, only survival. And by May of 1944, the Japanese attempted a countermeasure, welding steel plates behind their pilots to blunt the impact of the deadly convergence. Though it helped for a moment, it did not save their aircraft because 50 caliber rounds fired in unison did not simply puncture metal, they shattered whatever they touched, and the aircraft would break apart around the small shield, leaving the pilot unprotected and dying all the same. And the teacher from Kansas flew his final mission on May 15th. A simple sweep over captured territory, supposed to be easy yet intelligence, failed to detect a hidden Japanese airstrip, and 8 Corsairs suddenly faced 20 Zeros descending with altitude and surprise, and the first pass tore. Formation apart, leaving Moore inverted staring at the ocean with 2 Zeros locked onto him, and he pulled through a violent split, the G meter jumping to 9, and his vision washed out to red then black, and he flew by muscle memory alone, pushing, rolling, pulling as the Corsair groaned, and when his sight returned, the Zeros were gone, and he angled back into the fight, searching for targets, and a Zero crossed ahead at 1,500 feet, chasing another Corsair. And though outside the perfect convergence range, the angle favored him, so he fired a steady burst, walking the rounds into the enemy path, and enough bullets met in the right place to break the Zero apart. And then another Zero, swept in firing and rounds, smashed into Moore's aircraft, cracking the armor plate behind his head, and spraying oil across the canopy, and the engine coughed and shuddered and died, and he began losing altitude fast, and the Japanese pilot made the fatal mistake of drifting directly into 1,000 feet. And Moore used his last seconds of engine life to fire a perfect burst that erased the attacker, and then he glided toward Green Island, fighting gravity and distance as the engine seized at 8 miles out, and the runway rushed toward him, and he pumped the emergency gear handles until his arms burned and landed at 150 miles per hour, using every bit of runway before sliding into the jungle. And when the crew reached him, he sat calmly on the wing, writing a letter home, and his count for the war stood at 22 kills, all but 1 inside the convergence zone, and he would soon return home to teach math, trying, but never fully succeeding in forgetting the faces of the men who had flown into his invisible killing line. And the squadron records would eventually show 162 enemy aircraft destroyed, 19 Corsairs lost, 7 pilots killed, 3 missing, and 5 wounded. But the true legacy was the convergence zone, that perfect 1,000-foot alignment where 6 guns became a single devastating blade. The mission that was supposed to be simple began on a warm morning in mid-May 1944, when Lieutenant David Moore prepared for what would be his final flight, before heading home to meet the child he had never seen, and all intelligence claimed the area was safe, already swept by ground forces yet hidden among the thick jungle of a remote strip. The Japanese had quietly staged a desperate cluster of fighters, waiting for a moment when the Marines might relax their guard, and when 8 Corsairs crossed overhead, 20 Zeros rose from the tree line with the sun at their backs, and Altitude to spare, and the first pass tore the American formation apart, sending planes spinning, scattering, twisting in every direction as each pilot fought to survive, and more flipped inverted, seeing the ocean above his canopy and sky below him, and 2 Zeros clung to his tail, firing relentlessly, and he slammed the Corsair into a brutal split, pulling 9 GS, and feeling the world shrink into a red tunnel, then into pitch black, as his blood was forced from his head, and he flew by instinct alone, muscle memory guiding his hands as the wings groaned beneath the strain, until after several eternal seconds the blackout faded and his vision returned, and he found himself alone, battered, distant from the melee, but alive and climbing back toward the battle. And a moment later a Zero sliced in front of him, 1,500 feet away, chasing another Corsair, and though that distance was beyond the perfect 1,000-foot convergence, the angle was too clean to ignore, and he squeezed the trigger and the guns roared in a long, steady burst, and he watched the rounds walk across the Zero path, tearing into its fuselage until fire trailed behind it, and the plane broke apart, sliding downward in a long bleeding arc toward the sea, and then another Zero dove straight at him, firing before he could position himself, and bullets slammed into the Corsair armor plate, ringing like a struck bell, and oil splattered across the windscreen, making the world smear into dark streaks, and the engine coughed in a wounded sputter, gasping for life and catching only to sputter again, and Moore pushed the throttle forward, trying to coax the power plant back into breath while losing altitude and losing options as the Zero curved in behind him for the final kill. But the Japanese pilot made a fatal mistake, drifting too close, settling into that exact 1,000-foot death range, unaware that his approach had sealed his fate, and Moore used the final breath of his dying engine to pull the nose into position, and he fired a clean, precise 2-second burst, and the Zero vanished in a violent cloud, burning shards leaving nothing whole behind, and the Corsair engine seized completely a moment later, freezing in a metal screen, and the aircraft became a 7-ton glider, dropping through the air with terrible inevitability, and Moore steadied it using every bit of skill from 1,000 hours in cockpit, and he saw a green island ahead, a pale thin strip in a wide blue ocean, and he whispered to the machine not to give out, yet not until it reached the sand, and he counted the distance in his mind, 20 miles 15 10 8, and at 8 miles the engine locked forever, and he began gliding toward the island, calculating descent angles, wind drift, and runway length, because he had no power, no second chance, and no way to go around if he misjudged, so he lowered the landing gear by pumping the emergency hydraulics, the manual handle fighting against his arms, burning with pain, and he kept Corsair steady as it dropped to 500 feet, then 400, then 300, and the short runway stretched before him, looking impossibly small, and he touched down at nearly 150 miles per hour, bouncing once, then twice, skidding across the strip and sliding into the jungle, where the Corsair finally stopped with its nose buried in thick vegetation and dust settling around him. And when the rescue crew found him, he was sitting on the wing, calmly writing a letter home, his hands steady despite the adrenaline still racing through his blood. And he had survived his last mission, scoring 22 kills in the war, all but one inside that perfect convergence that had changed everything. And he would soon leave to teach math to young students, who would never know that their quiet instructor once commanded death in the sky through calculations of angle and distance and timing, and the squadron history recorded the cold numbers: a total of 162 Japanese aircraft destroyed, 19 Corsairs lost, 7 pilots killed, 3 missing, 5 wounded. But the true legacy was not in the tally, but in the invisible line drawn 1,000 feet from every Corsair. A small mathematical truth that gave these pilots the sharpest blade in the Pacific. And while Moore prepared to go home, the mechanic from Detroit completed his last duty training new men to maintain the convergence zone, ensuring they understood that 1,000 feet meant exactly 1,000. Never 990 nor 1,010, because small deviations meant lives lost, and as the veterans departed and new pilots arrived, the legend of the convergence zone spread like fire across the Pacific, until it became standard doctrine, shaping how every future Corsair would fight and survive. And though the war still raged on, the men of VMF 124 had already carved their mark into history, proving that in the violent chaos of aerial calm, that precision was the greatest weapon of all. The young pilot from Nebraska, who had once nearly drowned in his own oxygen mask, had written a letter the night before his final mission trying to explain to his parents what the convergence zone felt like, describing it as holding lightning in his hands and directing it with frightening precision. Though he crossed those words out and replaced them with simple thoughts about missing his mother cuisine and hoping his little brother stayed out of trouble, and by August 1944, the bent-wing Corsair had risen to absolute dominance in the Pacific skies, a machine once marked for its dangerous landing habits now feared so deeply that Japanese pilots refused to engage unless they had overwhelming numbers, and even then many hesitated because they knew that if they crossed into 1,000 feet of a Marine Corsair, they might cease to exist in a single heartbeat, and the fighter that had killed so many of its own trainees had become the angel of death and the symbol of American air mastery, and at the heart of its legend was the pure elegant rule of 6 guns meeting at one perfect distance and turning skill into certainty. And far from the war, the teacher from Kansas returned home to discover a life he did not recognize because his son, now 2 years old, called another man father, and his wife, believing him lost after his plane disappeared over Green Island, had remarried to a kind factory worker who had missing fingers and had been exempt from service and more. Knew at once he could not fight the situation because he too had changed into someone different, and he left quietly, moving to California to teach high school geometry, where he kept his past buried and never told his students that he had once used the same geometric principles to destroy 22 enemy planes, and he spent the rest of his life trying to balance the strange weight of being both a gentle teacher and a former instrument of war. And meanwhile, the Ohio farm boy, Lieutenant Hansen, stayed in the Marines and would go on to fly in Korea and Vietnam, piloting jets that made the Corsair seem like a relic, yet he never forgot the heavy vibration of 6 guns converging at exactly 1,000 feet. And even in later wars flying the mighty F4 Phantom, he would catch himself calculating distances that no longer mattered, as if the ghost of the convergence zone still lived inside him. And the mechanic from Detroit, who had changed the entire course of combat through his perfect bore sighting, returned home and spent his remaining years fixing cars, never speaking of the Pacific and never describing how many lives his precision had saved, and he died in 1962 from lung cancer brought on by decades of cigarettes that he had started smoking in the islands to fight mosquitoes. And in his final hours, drifting in and out of morphine dreams, he kept muttering about alignment and bore sighting, and the nurses thought he meant hunting rifles, but his wife understood he was back on the airstrip in the Solomons, ensuring the guns met at exactly 1,000 feet, because boys he cared about depended on that precision to come home alive. And the Corsair itself continued serving long after the war, flying until 1979 in various countries, and even fighting in the wild small wars of Central America, but none of those later versions carried the true heart of the Pacific fighter, because their guns were altered or their mounts replaced, and the mechanics maintaining them had no idea that the magic of the original lay not in the aircraft shape, but in the exact meeting point of 6 relentless streams of fire. And so those later Corsairs lived on as ghosts of their former selves, powerful but missing the mathematical soul that had made the early war bird legendary, and VMF 124 officially disbanded in 1946, its surviving pilot scattering into their quiet civilian lives, though a reunion was held in 1973, marking 30 years since their first brutal fights above the Solomons, and only 11 pilots attended, silver-haired men with damaged backs and fading eyesight, yet still carrying the same bond of those who had breathed death together in narrow strips of sky. And at that gathering they did not talk much about the war, because they did not need to. The understanding sat between them deep and wordless, and the teacher from Kansas died in 1981 after a life of gentle instruction and hidden memories, and his students never knew that the man who taught them how to solve triangles once used those triangles to end enemy pilots' lives, and when he passed his final lesson plan, remained on his desk a study of convergent lines meeting at a single point, and the substitute teacher believed it was merely about abstract geometry, but it was also the map of his past, and the Ohio farm boy lived until 1995, dying peacefully at 74. And when his grandson sorted through his belongings, he found a notebook filled with careful calculations, angles, speeds, distances, and ballistic estimates, and on the final page, written in trembling handwriting, was the simple phrase 1,000 feet, always 1,000 feet, and the grandson, an accountant who had never fired a weapon or flown a plane, did not understand the enormous weight of those words, and the last surviving pilot of VMF 124 died in 2001, closing the chapter on living memory, though the legend continued in museums and training manuals, and in the hearts of historians who understood that sometimes one idea could shift the balance of a war, and decades later, Japanese veterans spoke with unexpected respect for the Corsair, saying that the thing they feared most was not the plane itself but the strange instant in which a fellow pilot flying along beside them would suddenly explode into fragments because he had drifted unknowingly into the point where 6 American guns met, and one pilot, interviewed in 1985, said he still dreamed of that moment, not of dying but of the suddenness with which aircraft vanished in the Convergence, as though erased from the sky by an invisible blade. And the Corsair final wartime kill ratio reached an extraordinary 11-to-1, the highest of any American fighter. And though historians credited many factors, the pilots who had flown her knew the true reason lay in that perfect union of engineering precision and battlefield, understanding 6 guns, 1,000 feet, absolute destruction, absolute clarity, and absolute survival. Even decades after the war, the Japanese pilots who had survived the Solomons spoke of the Corsair with a mixture of awe and dread, and one veteran interviewed in 1985 confessed that the memory that haunted him was not fear of dying, but the terrible suddenness with which a plane beside him would vanish when those 6 American guns met their point of union, because the convergence zone felt less like combat and more like execution, erasing a man from the sky in a blink. And when historians later wrote about the war, they praised the Corsair for its speed, its armor, and its raw power, yet the pilots who had flown her knew the truth that the greatest weapon she carried was the invisible line drawn exactly 1,000 feet ahead, where 6 streams of bullets shaped into one impossible force. And the official American wartime records eventually revealed that the Corsair achieved a kill ratio of 11-to-1, the highest of any American fighter. Yet the men of VMF 124 understood that this astonishing record was built not upon chance or superior flying, but upon mathematical certainty, because the convergence zone removed hesitation and made each firing pack absolute. And after the war, life moved on, and the mechanic from Detroit's son grew up to become an engineer, never fully understanding the stories. His father never spoke aloud, but sensing somehow the importance of precision, and he devoted his career to designing instruments that required perfect alignment. And though he never knew the details, he carried inside him the quiet belief that the difference between 990 feet and 1,000 feet could mean everything. And by September 1945, the war came to an end, and the Corsairs that had once fought through storms and darkness and fire now sat quietly on peaceful airstrips, their wings folded like resting birds. And the new generation of pilots learned the convergence zone as part of their training, firing at target sleeves, suspended in the sky, and watching the rounds merge at exactly 1,000 feet. Yet those drills lacked the raw weight of the men who had lived it, because they had never known the dread of a zero sliding into view, or the grim finality of pressing the trigger knowing a life would end in the next fraction of a second. And many veterans wrestled with that burden in silence for the rest of their lives, because the convergence zone had made them efficient killers in a way few eras of warfare had ever seen. And Lieutenant Hansen, the Ohio farm boy, once calculated that he had been responsible for ending at least 24 lives, perhaps more, when accounting for probables and damaged aircraft that likely never made it home. And though he accepted that it had been necessary, he still carried the knowledge that each victory represented a human story permanently cut short. And yet he also understood that the Japanese pilots would have killed him and his squadron mates just as quickly had they been given the chance, because in war survival was not morality but mathematics, and the convergence zone simply sharpened the edge of that truth. And the Corsair itself would be remembered for many things: its inverted gull wings, its monstrous engine, its brutal training accidents, and its remarkable ability to endure punishment. But for the pilots who fought with it in 1943 and 1944, the aircraft would always be defined by the perfect union of 6 guns at 1,000 feet, the place where courage, instinct, engineering, and physics aligned to create something almost supernatural. And long after the guns fell silent, the teacher from Kansas left one final gift to history, discovered in a stack of papers after his death: a complete mathematical breakdown of the convergence zone written with the calm precision of a man who had spent his life teaching geometry, yet infused with the underlying weight of a man who had used that geometry to take lives, and his diagrams showed how the ballistic arcs intersected, how the density of fire grew exponentially at exactly 1,000 feet, and how the probability of a hit reached its peak within that narrow space. And though the mathematics was beautiful, anyone who understood the context also felt the heavy truth resting beneath those equations, that they described not abstract theory, but the destruction of men in the sky, and the final recorded combat between Corsairs took place during the brief football war between Honduras and El Salvador in 1969, long after jets had become the true masters of the sky, and by then the convergence zone had faded into legend, an old tale spoken by veterans who remembered what it meant to level a fighter and send a perfect burst spiraling toward an enemy who vanished upon contact with a point of pure force. And though by that time no mechanic aligned the guns with the same devotion as Sergeant Noak, and no pilot carried the cold geometric awareness of Moore or Hansen, that legacy lived on in every aviation manual that mentioned bore sightings, precision, and the importance of fire convergence. And when the last surviving pilot of VMF 124 died in 2001, he carried with him the final living memory of those desperate months, when a handful of tired young men changed air combat forever, and beneath the Pacific waves lie the remains of countless Zeros torn apart by converging 50 caliber fire, their twisted frames resting silently on the ocean floor, testament to a simple truth born in the chaos of war, that mathematics can be as deadly as any blade, and precision can shape history. And though the world has moved on, story of 6 guns meeting at exactly 1,000 feet remains one of the most extraordinary lessons in the art of survival and the terrible clarity of war, where for a brief moment in time the perfect alignment of metal geometry and human will carved victory from the sky itself. If you want more forgotten war stories told with truth, grit, and no filters, subscribe now. Your support keeps these missions alive.